Welcome back to Intro to Philosophy 1010. Our book is The World of Philosophy, an Introductory Reader by Stephen Kahn. And we are going over John Rawls' A Theory of Justice. So this is in preparation for Exam 5, and it'll be Part A, Question 2, of Rawls and Nozick, which presents the better argument on the nature of justice? Why explain? And Part B, Question 8, what does Rawls mean by justice as fairness? So, John Rawls is trying to come up with a process by which to determine in a fair way what constitutes a just state, a just relationship between individual human beings. And his theory is that we need to cover ourselves with what he calls a veil of ignorance, so that we don't know our initial positions. We don't know if we're rich or poor, or a man or a woman, white or black, a Christian, Jew, a Muslim, an atheist. None of these things do we know. That we have to hypothetically put ourselves in this, behind this veil of ignorance. And from that perspective, we need to set up a social system that we think is just. And the benefits of this veil of ignorance is that we can't manipulate the social system to prefer any one part of society over another if we don't know what part of society we belong to. And that this hypothetical philosophical process can help us come to a consensus about what constitutes a just society. And he says at the end, he says, this is page 486, the very last paragraph, on the right-hand column, the veil of ignorance makes possible a unanimous choice of a particular conception of justice. Without these limitations on knowledge, the bargaining problem of the original position would be hopelessly complicated. So he's saying it's extremely difficult to get a bunch of different people to agree on what is just. And in the previous video from Jorge Valadez, he discussed the problem of creating a sense of social solidarity in a multicultural democracy. And so Rawls is saying, okay, here's a trick for you. Pretend you don't know what culture you're from, and nobody does. You don't know anything about yourself other than a few stipulations, he'll say, that you know, that you're, I'm going to read this one on page 45, left-hand column. He says, obviously the purpose of these conditions, this initial veil of ignorance, is to present equality between human beings as, now I've written notes over this so many times I can't read this. I think it says moral persons as creatures having a conception of their good and capable of a sense of justice. So I thought, okay, if they're capable of having a conception of their good, but he's saying he wants them to forget what their current conception of the good is, and they're capable of a sense of justice, all right, how much of a veil of ignorance can you have and yet still retain a sense of what is good and what is just? That was a little confusing to me, but at any rate, I think it's an interesting approach. He's trying to simplify this incredibly difficult problem of defining justice. What is justice? Who would be the person unbiased enough to give a fair definition of what is just? It would seem that everyone will be influenced by their background, by their cultural identities, by their class distinctions, by their gender identification. So who should we trust? We can't trust anybody with such a biased perspective, John Rawls will say. We have to train ourselves to eliminate all of those considerations and just see ourselves as rational beings capable of coming to consensus. All right, so let me just read a little bit here. This is 483, A Theory of Justice. This was written in 1971, A Theory of Justice by John Rawls. It's excerpts from his article. The principle of justice. The principles of justice are the principles that free and rational persons concerned to further their own interests would accept in an initial position of equality. The original position of equality corresponds to the state of nature in the traditional theory of the social contract. We saw that with Thomas Hobbes in Leviathan. Everyone's essentially equal in the state of nature, says Thomas Hobbes, because no matter how much stronger or wittier than you are than any particular individual, almost any other individual could kill you. either sneaking up on you at nighttime or by banding together with others. So in a lawless state of nature, everyone is equally capable of killing everybody else. And that reason tells us we need to escape from this horrible law of nature where life is nasty, brutish, and short by creating peace by any means necessary, so long as other people are willing to forfeit some of their natural equality to kill whoever they think necessary, then we can have a social contract. Okay, so this original position is not, of course, thought of as an actual historical state of affairs, much less as a primitive condition of culture. It is understood as a purely hypothetical situation. Among the essential features of the situation is that no one knows his place in society, his class position or social status, nor does anyone know his fortune and the distribution of natural assets and abilities, his intelligence, strength, and the like. I shall even assume that the parties do not know their conceptions of the good or their special psychological propensities. The principles of justice are chosen behind a veil of ignorance. So whatever gifts you've been given by nature, you might be wittier or stronger or more beautiful than somebody else, or by the contingencies of social circumstances, your parents are wealthy, so now you have access to a better education and all these things. He's saying you have to be able to hypothetically erase those from your mind, and that gives us the best chance of coming to a fair definition of justice, or a just definition of justice. So the presumption is that fairness and justice are in a state of equality, that we have to be equal, although he's going to go on and say that it's okay if there's inequalities in society, so long as those inequalities benefit everybody involved. So let me just continue. Page 483, at the bottom of the right-hand column, for given the circumstances of the original position, the symmetry of everyone's relation to each other, this initial situation is fair between individuals as moral persons, that is, as rational beings with their own ends, and capable, I shall assume, of a sense of justice. The original position is, one might say, the appropriate initial status quo, and thus the fundamental agreements reached in it are fair. This explains the propriety of the name justice as fairness. So that was the Part B, question 8 for exam 5. What does he mean by justice as fairness? This is what he means, that this is this initial condition of total equality, a hypothetical, philosophical, speculative, insulated worldview in which you can pretend not to have any knowledge of any of your class or natural advantages. So it conveys the idea that the principles of justice are agreed to in an initial situation that is fair. I shall maintain that the persons in the initial situation would choose two principles. The first requires equality in the assignment of basic rights and duties, while the second holds that social and economic inequalities, for example, inequalities of wealth and authority, are just only if they result in compensating benefits for everyone, and in particular for the least advantaged members of society. These principles rule out justifying institutions on the grounds that the hardships of some are offset by a greater good in the aggregate. It may be expedient, but it is not just that some should have less in order that others may prosper. But there is no injustice in the greater benefits earned by a few, provided that the situation of persons not so fortunate is thereby improved. Okay, so if you put yourself in this hypothetical situation behind the veil of ignorance, and all you are is a person capable of a sense of justice, although you don't even know what justice is other than its fairness, he's saying. That to me seems to be a potential weak point in this philosophical idea, which I would explore if I had more time, but at any rate, he's saying if you're assuming that we are rational beings and we don't know what would advantage our particular situation, then people would come up with two principles. Any rational person, he believes, would come up with these two principles of justice. And you know what, I'm going to skip over to the left-hand column of page 485. So first, each person is to have an equal right to the most extensive scheme of equal basic liberties compatible with a similar scheme of liberties for others. That's the first thing this veil of ignorance will produce, the realization everyone should have an equal right to equal basic liberties. And second, social and economic inequalities are to be arranged so that they are both reasonably expected to be to everyone's advantage and attached to positions and offices open to all. These principles primarily apply to the basic structure of society and govern the assignment of rights and duties and regulate the distribution of social and economic advantages. Okay. So he's trying to simplify the practically impossible task of defining justice. How do we have a just society? We saw Plato do this in the Republic. And his idea was to see that we're all parts of the absolute idea of the good, which is the source of light in the visible universe and the source of consciousness and truth in the intelligible world. That you cannot have a just society until the leaders of society have seen the essence of the archetype of justice itself. John Rawls is taking a different perspective, and yet he's still depending on the fact of humans being rational beings, that because we have reason, we'll automatically come to the same conclusions. This is his assumption, and it, to me, appears to be a Platonic assumption. Because reason is, according to Plato, it's the eye of the soul with which you can see the absolute forms that underlie this material world. We saw in the cave allegory, according to Plato, via the literary character Socrates, that this material visible world, filled with temporary, ever-changing physical objects, is like a shadow projection or a mirror reflection of an eternal, intelligible world of absolute eternal forms of knowledge. If you see a tree, many different types of trees here, they're all imperfect copies of or projections of the absolute idea of tree. If you see different people acting justly or unjustly in this world, those are all approximations closer or farther away from the absolute idea of justice. And all of these absolute ideas, the abstract ideas like justice and beauty and courage and the virtues, as well as the concrete ideas like tree, rabbit, human, all of them are consolidated in the ultimate idea of the good. And that when the rulers of society have perceived this idea of the good with the eye of the soul, which is reason, then only can you have justice in society. That was Plato. That reason enables us to perceive these absolute ideas from which the material world emanates. But if there are not these absolute, eternal, fixed forms of knowledge, then it doesn't seem reasonable to expect reason to automatically come to the same conclusions in every different person. Because those conclusions, there would seem to be no fixed conclusions. And yet, John Rawls is assuming that there are. So I'm going to skip over on page 486. So this section, the veil of ignorance, I will, on the second paragraph, left-hand column, he says, it may be protested that the condition of the veil of ignorance is irrational. Surely some may object. Principles should be chosen in the light of all the knowledge available. There are various replies to this contention. To begin with, it is clear that since the differences among the parties are unknown to them, and everyone is equally rational and similarly situated, each is convinced by the same arguments. All right, I'll take issue with that, but let me continue. Therefore, we can view the arrangement in the original position from the standpoint of one person selected at random. So it's just select any random person, as long as they have reason, they're going to come to the same conclusion as everybody else, so he asserts. Certainly would simplify the situation, and that's what he's trying to do, simplify a complicated situation, but without, and he might else, there's a lot of three dots in this, so there's skipping a lot. He might assume there are some absolute forms of knowledge, though I doubt it, considering he's reverting to the veil of ignorance as his way of discovering the principle of justice, and he's not pointing to Plato. But at any rate, he says, if anyone, after due reflection, prefers the conception of justice to another, then they all do, and a unanimous agreement can be reached. We can, to make the circumstances more vivid, imagine that the parties are required to communicate with each other through a referee as intermediary, and that he is to announce which alternatives have been suggested and the reasons offered in their support. He forbids the attempt to form coalitions, and he informs the parties when they have come to an understanding. But such a referee is actually superfluous, assuming that the deliberations of the parties must be similar. All right, that's a huge assumption. The deliberations of the parties would be similar if they all shared the same premises. If the premises are the same, then they could deduce, using reason, certain moral definitions of justice from those shared premises. But would just having a veil of ignorance automatically leave them with the same first principles? Reason will serve these first principles, and I don't see how the veil of ignorance will reveal one first principle over another, although he's saying the one thing that they'll assume is that we should all start off equal, in an equal state. So that's a big assumption. That might sound, oh yeah, it's self-evident. Everyone would say that. In a democracy, sure, maybe that is the case, that almost everyone would say that, but throughout all time and all places on earth, that's not something that every reasonable human would assume. And even if they assume we're all equal in some respects, not in all. So he's intentionally trying to simplify the situation. That's what he said, and he's done this. It's a great simplification. Is it an oversimplification? I think it is in some ways, but at least he's addressing a very big problem. How do you define justice, especially in a multicultural society? And he's produced this process which at face value seems fair, but does it seem plausible? I would have to think about that a lot more. But at any rate, I think it's worth reading. It was an interesting read, so I'm going to continue here. He says, no one knows the situation in society nor his natural assets, and therefore no one is in a position to tailor principles to his advantage. But how does he know which principles are especially in his interest? So he's saying, if you assume you don't know what class you're from, then reason will automatically discover these two principles of justice, which he says are, just to go over this again, each person is to have an equal right to the most extensive scheme of equal basic liberties compatible with a similar scheme of liberties for others. So everyone is equal. You have equal right to these certain liberties. And you can take those liberties as far as you want, so long as they don't trespass on somebody else's liberties. That's the first thing he thinks this veil of ignorance over a rational person's mind would produce unanimity about. We all should have basic rights. Second, social and economic inequalities are okay if they are arranged in such a way that the advantages of the few, nevertheless, is for the greater advantage of everyone involved. In the capitalist society, the assumption would be, okay, it's good that some people are rich and some people aren't rich, because that goal of wealth drives some people to improve the situation for everybody. So that seems to be what he's saying. But if your drive to be rich causes you to compress everybody into a wage slave working as a cog in your industrial machine, well, then that would be unjust, because your advantages in society are coming not in a way that's lifting everybody up, but in a way that is oppressing many for the advantage of a small class. So I'll read again the final paragraph. Actually, I'll read the whole final paragraph. Page 486, the restrictions on particular information in the original position are then of fundamental importance. So this veil of ignorance is fundamentally important. Without them, we would not be able to work out any definite theory of justice at all. It's a broad statement. We would have to be content with a vague formula stating that justice is what would be agreed to without being able to say much, if anything, about the substance of the agreement itself. The veil of ignorance makes possible a unanimous choice of a particular conception of justice. Without these limitations on knowledge, the bargaining problem of the original position would be hopelessly complicated. So he's trying to say, let's get away, and I've said it before, but I'm just going to bring it back to Plato momentarily. If you erase from your mind your particular position in the hierarchy of society, then and then only, because we're all rational beings, we can come to a unanimous decision about what constitutes justice. Otherwise, he's saying it would be hopelessly complicated. So this initial condition, I think Plato offers another initial condition, and he's also saying you're a soul, you're not a body. This body isn't you, so therefore the social position isn't you. You're even this. Are you a male or are you a female? It can change with reincarnation. This is what he had Socrates saying. But the initial condition is we're all one with the idea of the good. We're all eternally equal, absolute sparks of this infinitely bright source of everything. And that is why, from that perspective, it makes sense to assume we're all equal, because we're all equally parts of this absolute standard of what is good and what is just. And if you can't perceive that source of yourself and everything else imprinted on your soul, then there's no hope for justice. But there's some elements that are similar. The veil of ignorance is you're aware of your current physical position in the socioeconomic system, but you should not identify with that, which has the same effect of having a veil of ignorance. Okay, I think I will leave this one at that.